In 1849, a daguerreotype photograph was taken at Blackwood Plantation in rural Alabama, capturing what appeared to be an ordinary family portrait. The plantation owner, William Blackwood, his wife Catherine, and their daughter Margaret, a young woman of considerable size whose expression seemed oddly vacant. The photograph survived in a private collection for over 170 years, passed down through generations who knew nothing of its dark origins. It wasn't until 2019, when a descendant donated family archives to the Alabama Historical Society, that researchers began uncovering the disturbing truth behind that frozen moment. Margaret Blackwood's story had been deliberately erased from official records. Her death certificate listed natural causes, but oral histories preserved among descendants of enslaved families told a vastly different tale, one of systematic abuse, a secret program of forced reproduction, and a rebellion so shocking that local authorities conspired to bury it forever. The photograph became evidence of crimes hidden in plain sight, a testament to suffering that powerful families worked desperately to erase. What happened to Margaret Blackwood's body in the summer of 1849 remained one of the most disturbing secrets of the antebellum South, a story so horrifying that witnesses were threatened into silence, documents were burned, and an entire community chose collective amnesia over confronting the truth. But secrets buried in plantation soil have a way of resurfacing, and Margaret's story, along with the stories of those who suffered under her family's reign, would eventually demand to be told. The truth lay hidden in crumbling courthouse records, coded entries in plantation ledgers, and the persistent memories of families who refused to let their ancestors' suffering be forgotten. This is the story of what really happened at Blackwood Plantation, and why that photograph captures not just a moment, but a monument to unspeakable crimes. Capítulo 1. O retrato e o silêncio. 850 a 950 palavras. Há 176 anos, em uma plantação isolada no interior do Alabama, documentos militares e registros locais mencionaram um caso tão perturbador que acabou enterrado em silêncio. Margaret Blackwood desapareceu dos registros oficiais após agosto de 1849, mas não da memória oral da comunidade afro-americana local. A ausência deixou cicatrizes profundas, marcando gerações com um trauma silencioso que só agora começa a ser revelado. Antes de seguir, inscreva-se e ative o sininho. Aqui a gente desenterra segredos enterrados pela história oficial e dá voz ao que foi silenciado. The photograph itself is unremarkable at first glance. 3 figures, posed stiffly before the plantation house, as was customary in an era when photography required subjects to remain motionless for extended periods. William Blackwood stands rigidly in his finest suit, his expression stern and patriarchal. Catherine Blackwood sits beside him, her face partially obscured by the bonnet fashionable in that era. Between them stands Margaret, 23 years old, her substantial frame draped in layers of fabric that seem to swallow her diminishing form. But it's Margaret's eyes that draw attention once you know the story. They stare past the camera with an emptiness that seems to transcend the technical limitations of early photography. Later analysis by forensic psychologists would describe her expression as dissociative, the look of someone whose mind had retreated from unbearable reality. Her hands, visible in the photograph, show signs of swelling. Her posture suggests difficulty standing. These details meant nothing to casual observers for over a century and a half. The photograph was taken by an itinerant photographer named Samuel Hendricks, who traveled through Alabama capturing images of wealthy plantation families. His business ledger, discovered in 2021 in a Massachusetts attic, contains a brief notation beside the Blackwood entry. Difficult sitting. Subject unwell. Family insisted on proceeding. Hendricks left Alabama 3 weeks after taking the photograph and never returned to the region, a departure that would later seem significant. Blackwood Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime cotton-growing land in what was then the heart of Alabama's Black Belt. William Blackwood owned 73 enslaved people by 1849, their names recorded in plantation ledgers with the same clinical detachment used for livestock. The plantation operated with brutal efficiency, producing cotton that enriched the Blackwood family while destroying the lives of those forced to cultivate it. Margaret had been the Blackwoods' only surviving child. 2 brothers had died in infancy, leaving her as sole heir to the family's considerable fortune. Historical records describe her as having been sickly throughout childhood, struggling with ailments that modern medical analysis suggests may have included thyroid disorders and other metabolic conditions. Her obesity, far from being mere overindulgence, likely stemmed from untreated medical issues compounded by the limited understanding of health in that era. But Margaret's physical condition became intertwined with something far more sinister. Letters discovered in 2019 reveal that William Blackwood had become obsessed with ensuring the continuation of his bloodline. With Margaret as his only heir, and her marriage prospects limited by both her health and her father's controlling nature, Blackwood developed a plan that would horrify even by the depraved standards of slave-owning society. Beginning around 1846, plantation ledgers show unusual notations appearing in coded language. References to breeding stock increase dramatically. Certain enslaved men are moved to quarters near the main house. Medical supplies are ordered in quantities that exceed normal plantation needs. And most tellingly, Margaret's own journal, fragments of which survived hidden in a false bottom of a trunk, begins recording visits to her room by enslaved men. Visits she describes with growing horror and resignation. The program William Blackwood instituted at his plantation went beyond the already abhorrent practice of forced breeding among enslaved people. He was attempting to create heirs through his daughter, using enslaved men as unwilling participants in a scheme designed to produce children who would carry Blackwood blood while being legally classified as property. The legal gymnastics required for such a plan reveal the twisted logic of slavery's defenders. Children would follow the condition of the mother, making them technically enslaved, but Blackwood apparently intended to maneuver around this through some form of adoption or legal recognition. Margaret's fragmentary journal entries from this period are almost unbearable to read. She writes of her father's insistence, her mother's silent complicity, and her own powerlessness within her family's twisted hierarchy. She describes being confined to her room for weeks at a time, attended only by enslaved women who were themselves victims of the plantation's brutality. She records the names of men forced into her presence, noting their obvious distress and her own shame at being used as an instrument of her father's obsession. The enslaved community at Blackwood Plantation lived under a reign of terror during these years. Those who resisted or spoke against the program faced savage punishment. Families were separated as leverage. Children were threatened. The overseers, complicit in Blackwood's schemes, wielded violence with casual cruelty to maintain the system's terrible machinery. By 1849, Margaret had endured 3 years of this nightmare. Her health, never robust, deteriorated under the physical and psychological strain. The photograph captures her near the end, a young woman whose body and spirit had been systematically destroyed by her own father's monstrous ambitions. Within weeks of that photograph being taken, everything would change at Blackwood Plantation in ways that would haunt the region for generations. Capítulo 2. O Sistema do Silêncio. 850 palavras. The machinery of oppression at Blackwood Plantation operated with chilling precision, sustained by a network of complicity that extended far beyond the plantation's boundaries. Understanding what happened to Margaret Blackwood requires understanding how thoroughly the system of slavery corrupted every institution it touched, transforming potential witnesses into silent collaborators, and truth into something malleable, subject to the needs of power. Local physician Dr. Amos Pritchard visited Blackwood Plantation monthly throughout the late 1840s. His medical records, preserved in county archives, but never properly examined until recently, paint a disturbing picture of professional ethics sacrificed to social standing. Pritchard documented Margaret's declining health in clinical language that carefully avoided mentioning the obvious causes. He prescribed laudanum for her nervous condition and bed rest for her female complaints, standard euphemisms of the era that concealed rather than revealed. But more significantly, Pritchard's records also document his treatment of enslaved people at Blackwood Plantation, and here the pattern becomes unmistakable. Between 1846 and 1849, he treated an unusual number of enslaved men for injuries described as accidents or falls. The timing of these treatments corresponds precisely with the periods when plantation ledgers show these same men being housed near the main residence. The implications are inescapable. Men who resisted William Blackwood's program faced violence, and the local physician dutifully recorded their suffering while maintaining the fiction of accidental harm. The complicity extended to the religious community. Reverend Jonathan Marsh presided over the local Baptist church that the Blackwood family attended. His sermons, some preserved in church archives, frequently addressed the biblical justification for slavery and the duty of servants to obey their masters. After Margaret's death, Marsh delivered a eulogy praising her as a dutiful daughter who suffered nobly through illness. He made no mention of the circumstances that had destroyed her health and spirit. Church records show that Reverend Marsh baptized at least 3 infants born to enslaved women at Blackwood Plantation during the relevant period, children whose parentage was deliberately obscured in baptismal records. The notations list only the mother's names, leaving the father's identities blank, a common practice when the father was white and powerful, but unusual when both parents were enslaved. These children disappeared from records within months of their births, their fates unknown but easily guessed. The legal system provided another layer of protection for William Blackwood's crimes. County Sheriff Thomas Wardlaw maintained order in the district through selective enforcement that favored wealthy planters. His correspondence, discovered in state archives, reveals a man deeply embedded in the plantation economy, whose family owned enslaved people, and whose political future depended on maintaining good relations with men like Blackwood. When complaints about conditions at Blackwood Plantation reached Wardlaw's office, and oral histories insist such complaints were made, though official records conveniently contain none, he consistently sided with property owners over the enslaved. The few documented cases of enslaved people seeking protection from authorities in that county during this period all ended the same way. The complainants were returned to their enslavers, often to face punishment for the audacity of seeking justice. The economic ties binding the community to plantation interest ran deep. Local merchants extended credit to planters, accepted cotton as payment, and profited from the entire system. The merchant who supplied Blackwood Plantation with goods also served as unofficial banker, holding mortgages and extending loans, secured by enslaved people as collateral. His account books, preserved by descendants who never examined them closely, show transactions that reveal the cold mathematics of slavery. Human beings valued, traded, and leveraged like any other commodity. This merchant, Harrison Webb, appears in later testimony as someone who visited Blackwood Plantation frequently during the period in question. His presence gave him knowledge of conditions there, yet his correspondence contains not a single word of concern or criticism. Instead, he congratulated William Blackwood on his scientific approach to agricultural improvement, language that takes on sinister meaning when understood as reference to the forced breeding program. The enslaved community at Blackwood Plantation lived within this suffocating system of complicity and control, knowing that no appeal to outside authority would bring help. They developed their own networks of communication, passing information between plantations through various means: preachers who traveled to hold services, enslaved people hired out for temporary work, even the carefully coded messages embedded in spirituals sung in the fields. It was through these networks that word spread about what was happening to Margaret Blackwood and to the enslaved men and women caught in her father's twisted scheme. The oral histories preserved in families descended from Blackwood's enslaved community speak of meetings held in secret, of debates about resistance and its costs, of the terrible calculations required when rebellion meant not just personal risk, but danger to children and loved ones. One name appears repeatedly in these oral histories: Samuel, described as a man of exceptional intelligence who could read despite the laws forbidding enslaved people's education, who served as a leader within the enslaved community, and who eventually helped organize what would become known simply as the uprising in whispered conversations passed down through generations. Samuel appears in Blackwood's plantation ledgers as Sam, valued at $1,200, marked as a field hand. But his true role was far more significant. The system of silence that protected William Blackwood seemed impenetrable. Every institution that might have opposed his cruelty instead enabled it, bound by economic interest, racial ideology, and simple moral cowardice. This was the world Margaret inhabited, where her suffering mattered less than her father's property rights, where the humanity of enslaved people was denied as a matter of law and custom, and where truth was whatever powerful men declared it to be. But systems built on injustice contain the seeds of their own destruction, and by the summer of 1849, those seeds were about to bear terrible fruit. Capítulo 3. Os Fragmentos da Verdade. 850, 950 palavras. The evidence that survived William Blackwood's attempts to erase the truth emerged from unlikely places, fragments preserved through accident, oversight, or the determination of people who refused to let these crimes be forgotten. Piecing together what happened at Blackwood Plantation required historians to work like archaeologists, sifting through scattered remnants to reconstruct a story that powerful interests had tried to bury forever. Margaret's journal provided the most direct testimony, though only portions survived. The diary was discovered in 2019 when a descendant of the Blackwood family, clearing out a deceased relative's home in Mobile, Alabama, found a trunk that had belonged to Catherine Blackwood. Hidden beneath a false bottom, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it through nearly 2 centuries, lay a leather-bound volume containing Margaret's increasingly desperate entries from 1846 to 1849. The journal begins innocuously enough, with observations about weather, descriptions of social visits, complaints about minor ailments, but beginning in late 1846, the tone shifts dramatically. Margaret writes of confrontations with her father, of his insistence that she must provide heirs by whatever means necessary. She describes her mother's silence as betrayal, noting Catherine's presence during conversations where William outlined his plans, but her complete failure to object or protect her daughter. By 1847, the entries become fragmented and distressed. Margaret records being confined to her room, writes of visits by enslaved men whose names she carefully documents, perhaps the only record that honored their existence as individuals rather than property. She describes her own horror at being made complicit in their oppression, her powerlessness to refuse her father's demands, and her growing awareness that she was as much a prisoner as the people her family enslaved. The journal's most devastating entries come from early 1849. Margaret writes of pregnancies that ended in miscarriage, of her deteriorating health, of her father's increasing frustration, and the corresponding escalation of violence against enslaved people on the plantation. She mentions Samuel by name, noting that he alone showed her kindness when delivering food to her room, and that his eyes seemed to hold both pity and something else, perhaps a promise that this suffering would not continue forever. The final entry, dated July 28, 1849, consists of a single line: "I pray God will forgive what I am about to do, and what others must do for us all to be free." Plantation ledgers provided another crucial source, though their information required careful interpretation. William Blackwood maintained meticulous records of his property, including the enslaved people he owned. Cross-referencing these ledgers with the coded language he used revealed patterns that confirmed the breeding program's existence and scope. Certain enslaved men were regularly moved from field quarters to the main house area. Their work assignments changed from agricultural labor to vaguely described domestic duties. Medical expenses for these men increased during periods when they were assigned to housework. And most tellingly, several men listed in ledgers from 1846 disappear entirely from records by 1850, with notations like "sold south" or "deceased," providing no actual documentation of sales or deaths. The ledgers also track births among enslaved women with unusual precision during this period, noting not just the births but medical interventions, wet nurses hired, and special food provisions. For a man who treated enslaved people as mere property in most respects, William Blackwood showed remarkable concern for certain pregnancies and infants, those he believed might carry his family's bloodline. Court records from surrounding counties provided oblique confirmation through their very incompleteness. Property disputes between planters typically generated extensive documentation, yet records involving Blackwood Plantation from this period are mysteriously sparse. Estate settlements that should have included detailed inventories of enslaved people show obvious gaps, and several cases that began with filings mentioning Blackwood were abruptly withdrawn without explanation, suggesting settlements or pressure applied behind the scenes. But perhaps the most powerful evidence came from oral histories, preserved in families descended from those enslaved at Blackwood Plantation. These stories, passed down through generations with remarkable consistency, provided details that no written record captured: the daily texture of life under William Blackwood's rule, the fear that permeated every aspect of existence, and the growing determination that led to rebellion. These oral histories name Samuel as the leader who organized resistance, describing him as a man who could read and write, who preached in secret gatherings, and who convinced others that their lives and dignity mattered enough to risk everything. They describe meetings held in the quarters after dark, where Samuel spoke of biblical exodus and earthly justice, where plans were made and courage was summoned. The oral histories also preserve something else: sympathy for Margaret Blackwood. Unlike written accounts by white Alabamians that portrayed her simply as a victim of enslaved people's violence, these family stories recognize her as another victim of her father's cruelty. trapped by gender and social expectations, just as enslaved people were trapped by law and violence. They describe her acts of small kindness, extra food shared, warnings given when her father planned punishment, even her apparent willingness to participate in what came next. Agora te convido a deixar nos comentários de onde você está nos assistindo e o horário exato em que escuta esta história. Quero saber até onde chegam esses relatos silenciados. Physical evidence emerged much later, in 2003, during construction of a shopping center on land that had once been part of Blackwood Plantation. Workers discovered human remains in what appeared to be an unmarked mass grave. Initial analysis suggested the remains dated to the mid-19th century. Further examination revealed evidence of violence, bones showing blade marks, skulls with fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, signs of burning. The discovery prompted a proper archaeological investigation that uncovered more remains and artifacts that told their own story. Personal items buried with the dead, a carved wooden cross, buttons from clothing, fragments of pottery, suggested these were people whose deaths someone had wanted to memorialize, even in secret. The location itself, in a wooded area away from both the main cemetery and the slave burial ground, indicated these deaths were meant to be hidden. Forensic analysis dated the burials to approximately 1849, precisely matching the period when records show multiple enslaved people disappearing from Blackwood's ledgers. The remains included both men and women, ranging in age from late teens to middle age. Evidence of malnutrition and disease was present, but the immediate cause of death for most was clearly violence. These fragments, Margaret's journal, plantation ledgers, oral histories, and physical remains, gradually assembled into a coherent narrative of systematic abuse, desperate resistance, and terrible consequences. The photograph taken in 1849 became not just a portrait but evidence, capturing the moment before everything collapsed into violence that would scar the region for generations. Capítulo 4. A conspiração revelada. 850 palavras. The full scope of William Blackwood's scheme emerged slowly from the historical fragments, revealing a conspiracy that extended beyond mere sexual exploitation into a calculated attempt to perpetuate slavery through his own bloodline while maintaining legal control over his descendants. The plan's twisted logic demonstrated how thoroughly the institution of slavery had corrupted moral reasoning among those who benefited from it. Documents discovered in 2020 shed new light on Blackwood's intentions. A letter from William to his brother Charles, who lived in South Carolina, outlined the scheme with chilling clarity. Written in 1845, before the program's implementation, the letter discusses Blackwood's concern about his family's future given Margaret's poor health and limited marriage prospects. He writes of his determination to ensure Blackwood blood continues to work Blackwood land, even if Margaret never married. The letter continues with a legal analysis that reveals Blackwood had consulted attorneys about his plan. Under Alabama law, children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved regardless of the father's status, but Blackwood believed he could navigate around this through eventual manumission of children he acknowledged as carrying his bloodline, followed by adoption or inheritance arrangements that would give them claim to his property while maintaining social and legal superiority over other formerly enslaved people. It was a scheme predicated on maintaining absolute control over his daughter, over the enslaved men forced to participate, over the children who would result, and over the legal system that he assumed would bend to accommodate a wealthy planter's wishes. That such a plan seemed viable to Blackwood reveals how completely the slave system had corrupted justice and humanity in the antebellum South. Attorney correspondence found in county archives confirms that Blackwood sought legal advice about his intentions. Richmond Chambers, a prominent Alabama attorney, exchanged letters with Blackwood discussing the legal implications of acknowledging mixed-race children as heirs. Chambers advised caution, noting that such arrangements might face challenge from other relatives and could undermine the entire social structure that maintained white supremacy. But Chambers did not refuse to help structure the arrangement. Instead, he suggested creating a trust that would provide for certain enslaved children while maintaining legal fictions about their status. He recommended documenting everything to establish clear lineage while using coded language that would prevent casual observers from understanding the true relationships involved. The correspondence reveals a legal mind working diligently to facilitate what both men must have known was morally abhorrent. The involvement of Catherine Blackwood remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the conspiracy. Margaret's journal makes clear that her mother knew what was happening and chose complicity over protection of her daughter. But newly discovered letters between Catherine and her sister in Georgia suggest her participation was more active than mere passive acceptance. In a letter dated March 1847, Catherine writes to her sister about managing Margaret's difficult temperament and ensuring her daughter's cooperation with family necessities. She describes administering laudanum to keep Margaret calm and compliant during periods when her resistance grew too strong. She discusses the challenge of preventing Margaret from communicating with people outside the plantation who might interfere. Catherine's letters also reveal her own desperation to maintain social standing and financial security. As a woman in the 19th century South, her position depended entirely on her husband's wealth and status. She apparently calculated that protecting Margaret from William's scheme would mean losing everything, while cooperation ensured her continued comfort. It was a moral calculation that prioritized self-preservation over maternal protection, and one that haunted her descendants when the truth emerged. The conspiracy required the cooperation of enslaved women who attended to Margaret. Plantation records show that several women were assigned specifically to care for her during this period, women whose own histories of suffering under slavery made them unwilling collaborators in another woman's torment. Oral histories describe their impossible position. Refusing orders meant punishment or sale, but complying made them accomplices in Margaret's abuse. These women, Sarah, Ruth, and Hannah, according to plantation ledgers, found subtle ways to resist within their constrained circumstances. They slowed tasks when possible, provided comfort to Margaret when they could do so safely, and passed information about conditions in the main house to others in the enslaved community. Their agency was limited, but they exercised what power they possessed to mitigate harm while surviving in an impossible situation. The men forced to participate in Blackwood's program faced even more direct violence. Samuel, who emerges as the eventual leader of resistance, was among those initially selected. Oral histories describe him as having been brought to the main house in early 1847, where he understood immediately what was expected. When he refused, overseers beat him severely and threatened to sell his wife and children. Faced with this impossible choice, Samuel apparently complied enough to avoid immediate punishment while beginning to organize resistance. He used his literacy, acquired in secret despite laws forbidding enslaved people's education, to gather information, understand legal documents left carelessly accessible, and communicate with others. His intelligence and leadership gradually transformed scattered individual suffering into collective determination to end the nightmare they were all enduring. Other men responded differently to the same impossible situation. Some complied out of fear, some attempted escape and were caught and punished. Some simply endured while their spirits broke under the weight of their powerlessness. The variation in responses reflects the complexity of human nature under extreme oppression. There was no single right way to survive something so fundamentally wrong. By mid-1849, Blackwood's program had produced at least 4 pregnancies among enslaved women at the plantation, along with Margaret's own miscarriages that damaged her health severely. The conspiracy seemed secure, protected by law, supported by local authorities, and enforced through violence. William Blackwood's vision of perpetuating his bloodline while maintaining control over his descendants appeared to be succeeding. But the seeds of rebellion were growing, nourished by every act of cruelty, every instance of callous disregard for human dignity, every moment when the enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation looked at each other and recognized their shared suffering and their shared humanity. The conspiracy was about to unravel in ways its architects never imagined possible. Capítulo 5. O Plano da Liberdade, 850–950 palavras. The rebellion that would shatter Blackwood Plantation's nightmare took months to plan, requiring careful coordination under constant surveillance and extraordinary courage from people who had every reason to believe that failure meant death. The conspiracy to resist William Blackwood's conspiracy emerged from desperation, faith, and the simple human refusal to accept degradation as inevitable. Samuel's role as organizer became possible because of his unusual position within the plantation hierarchy. Though officially listed as a field hand, he had been taught carpentry by his father and was occasionally loaned to other plantations for skilled work. These temporary assignments gave him opportunities to communicate with enslaved people beyond Blackwood's immediate control, creating networks of information and solidarity that stretched across the county. During these outside assignments, Samuel learned about successful escapes, about underground railroad routes, about sympathetic people, both black and white, who opposed slavery. He also learned about rebellions, both successful and failed, understanding the tactics that worked and the mistakes that led to capture and execution. This knowledge became the foundation for planning that began in earnest in early 1849. The first meetings happened in the Plantation's chapel, a small structure where enslaved people were permitted to hold services under the supervision of white observers. Samuel used Bible study sessions to speak in carefully coded language about Moses leading his people from bondage, about Jericho's walls falling, about faith that moved mountains. These weren't just religious lessons, but calls to action disguised as theology, ways of building courage and commitment while avoiding detection. But the actual planning happened in more secret locations. The quarters where enslaved families lived offered some privacy after dark, though the risk of informers or accidental discovery was always present. Samuel and other leaders, including a woman named Ruth who served in the main house and provided crucial intelligence, gathered people in small groups, sharing information and testing commitment. Ruth's position attending to Margaret gave her access to information others lacked. She observed William Blackwood's routines, knew when he would be away from the plantation on business, understood the layout of the main house and where weapons were kept. She also developed an unexpected alliance with Margaret herself, who by 1849 had become desperate enough to consider any escape from her circumstances. The relationship between Ruth and Margaret, preserved in oral histories, reveals the complexity of human connection across the barriers slavery erected. Ruth saw in Margaret another victim of William Blackwood's cruelty, even as she understood that Margaret's whiteness and class position gave her privileges that enslaved women would never possess. Margaret saw in Ruth someone who showed her kindness without seeking favor, whose strength contrasted sharply with her own powerlessness. According to these oral histories, Margaret asked Ruth directly in July 1849 whether the enslaved people were planning resistance. Ruth's response was careful but honest. She said that no one could continue living as they were, that something had to change, and that Margaret should consider what side of that change she wanted to be on. Margaret's final journal entry, written shortly after this conversation, suggests she made her choice. The plan that emerged involved multiple coordinated elements, each risky on its own, and potentially catastrophic if any part failed. The core strategy centered on timing the rebellion for a night when William Blackwood would be away on business, a trip to Mobile that happened quarterly when he sold cotton and conducted banking business. Catherine would be in the house with only minimal security, as Blackwood took his most trusted overseers with him on these trips. The rebels planned to secure the main house first, preventing anyone from escaping to sound an alarm or summon help. They would then raid the overseers' quarters for weapons and supplies before making their escape. The destination was the swamps 20 miles to the south, difficult terrain that would slow pursuit and offer cover. From there, some hoped to reach Mobile and flee by ship, while others planned to use underground railroad contacts to move north. Critical to the plan was preventing violence beyond what was absolutely necessary for securing freedom. Samuel insisted on this, arguing both moral and practical grounds. Morally, he said they must not become the monsters that slavery had made of their oppressors. Practically, he knew that killing whites would bring savage retaliation, not just on them, but on enslaved people throughout the region. The goal was escape and freedom, not revenge. But the plan contained a troubling element that oral histories acknowledge with obvious discomfort: Margaret Blackwood's fate. Samuel and the other leaders debated what to do about her. She was simultaneously a victim of her father's cruelty and a member of the family that enslaved them. Some argued for simply leaving her behind, others for taking her as a hostage to slow pursuit, still others for bringing her along if she wished to escape her father's control. The decision, according to these histories, came from Margaret herself. In a secret conversation with Ruth just days before the planned rebellion, Margaret revealed that her health was failing, that she believed her father's abuse had destroyed her body beyond recovery, and that she wanted to help ensure the success of the escape even if she could not participate in it. What exactly she proposed, and how the rebels responded, would become the most controversial and misunderstood aspect of what followed. The date was set for August 15, 1849. William Blackwood departed for Mobile on August 12th, taking 3 overseers with him. He expected to be gone 5 days. In his absence, Catherine Blackwood supervised the plantation with the help of 2 remaining overseers and several drivers chosen from among the enslaved men for their willingness to enforce discipline against their own people. The rebels had 72 hours to execute their plan, secure their freedom, and escape before William Blackwood's return. But in those 3 days, something would happen that would transform their bid for freedom into a mystery that haunted the region for over a century and a half. Capítulo 6. A Noite do Silêncio, 850-950 palavras. August 14, 1849, dawned clear and hot over Blackwood Plantation, the kind of oppressive summer day that made labor in the cotton fields nearly unbearable. But the weather's brutality was welcomed by those who knew what was planned for that night. It meant overseers would retreat to shade during the hottest hours, that routines would be disrupted, that the slight changes necessary for their plan might go unnoticed. Ruth moved through the main house that day, performing her usual duties while mentally mapping every detail that might matter when darkness fell. She noted that Catherine Blackwood seemed more irritable than usual, snapping at servants over minor issues. Margaret remained in her room, as she had for most of the previous month, her health deteriorating to the point that even standing exhausted her. In the quarters, Samuel worked with quiet intensity to ensure everyone understood their roles. 23 people would participate directly in the rebellion, men and women carefully chosen for their commitment and their particular skills. Others knew what was planned, but would not participate actively, remaining to care for children and elderly people who could not manage the flight through difficult terrain. The decision about who would go and who would stay represented perhaps the most agonizing choices people already living with impossible burdens had to make. Families were being split by this decision, parents leaving children behind, siblings separated, couples forced apart by circumstances that made some capable of escape while others were not. The pain of these separations was understood to be temporary. Those who escaped successfully would work to purchase freedom for those left behind, or would return to help them escape later. These were desperate hopes, but hope was all they had to sustain them through what was coming. As the sun set, the plantation settled into its evening routine. Overseers made their final rounds, ensuring enslaved people were in their assigned quarters. Catherine Blackwood dined alone in the main house, attended by Ruth and one other servant. Margaret remained isolated in her room upstairs. The 2 remaining overseers ate together in their quarters near the stable, drinking whiskey as they did most evenings when William Blackwood was absent. At 9 o'clock, according to testimony later given by survivors, the action began. Samuel and 4 other men approached the overseers' quarters silently, years of experience moving through plantation grounds without detection serving them now. They burst through the door while the overseers were distracted by drink, overwhelming them before either could reach the weapons kept nearby. The overseers were bound, gagged, and secured in a locked storage building. Simultaneously, Ruth and 3 women in the main house moved to secure the building. They confronted Catherine Blackwood in the dining room, preventing her from accessing a bell used to summon help. Catherine's initial response, according to oral histories, was outrage at the impertinence of enslaved people confronting her directly. She demanded they return to their quarters immediately, apparently unable to comprehend that the social order she depended on was collapsing around her. When Ruth explained calmly that they were leaving and that Catherine would not be harmed if she remained quiet, Catherine's outrage transformed into panic. She began screaming, bringing the situation to a crisis point. The rebels had not planned for sustained resistance from her. They had assumed she would yield once the situation was clear. Her continued screaming threatened to wake neighbors on adjacent plantations, potentially bringing help that would doom the entire escape. The oral histories become less specific about what happened next, suggesting that even descendants of those involved found this part of the story difficult to recount. What is clear is that Catherine Blackwood was silenced, restrained, and secured in a locked room. Whether this involved violence beyond the minimum necessary remains debated by historians who have examined the conflicting accounts. Meanwhile, upstairs, Margaret's situation presented a different challenge. When rebels entered her room, they found her prepared, dressed in clothing suitable for travel, with a small bag of possessions beside her bed. She had been expecting them. The conversation that followed, preserved in oral histories through Ruth's later accounts, revealed Margaret's final choice. Margaret knew she was dying. The abuse her body had suffered, combined with her existing health problems, had brought her to the point where even breathing required effort. She could not possibly survive a flight through swamps, could not keep pace with people fleeing for their lives, but she could ensure they succeeded. She could provide one final act of resistance against her father's tyranny, and one last assertion of her own will. She told Ruth and Samuel that they should use her death to cover their escape. If she died in a way that appeared to be murder by enslaved people, the investigation would focus on capturing her killers rather than on understanding the broader rebellion. It would buy time for others to reach safety. It would give meaning to her suffering and death that her father's plans could never provide. The rebels initially refused, horrified by what she was proposing, but Margaret insisted. According to these accounts, she said she was already dying, that every day alive meant more suffering, and that this way her death could serve freedom rather than slavery. After lengthy debate, and with obvious reluctance, Samuel and the others agreed to honor her choice. Se esta história já te prendeu, deixa o like. Isso ajuda a história de Margaret Blackwood e todos que sofreram em Blackwood Plantation a alcançar mais gente. What exactly happened in Margaret's room that night became the center of myth and misunderstanding that persisted for over a century. The official story told by white Alabamians was that enslaved people murdered Margaret in cold blood during a violent uprising. The truth, preserved in oral histories and partially confirmed by Margaret's own journal, was that she made a conscious choice to die in a way that would protect those escaping slavery's brutality. By midnight, 23 people had left Blackwood Plantation, moving south toward the swamps under cover of darkness. Behind them, they left a plantation shocked into silence, a dead woman whose story would be twisted to serve the interests of slavery's defenders and secrets that would take generations to uncover. Capítulo 7. A descoberta e o massacre. 850-950 palavras. Dawn broke on August 15, 1849, revealing the transformation that had occurred at Blackwood Plantation during the night. The absence of morning activity alerted neighboring planters that something was wrong. When they arrived to investigate, they found the plantation's overseers bound and imprisoned, Catherine Blackwood traumatized and incoherent, and Margaret Blackwood dead in her room under circumstances that would be deliberately misrepresented for the next 176 years. The scene in Margaret's room became the foundation for the official narrative that white authorities constructed to serve their interests. She lay in her bed, life gone, in a manner that suggested suffocation. The physical evidence was ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, but local authorities chose the narrative that best served the slave system. Margaret had been murdered by rebellious enslaved people in an act of unprovoked violence. This interpretation served multiple purposes. It transformed a young woman's desperate choice to help others escape oppression into a story of victimhood that justified savage retaliation. It obscured the systematic abuse that had destroyed Margaret's health and spirit, focusing attention on her death rather than the circumstances of her life. Most importantly, it provided justification for the violence that white authorities unleashed in response to the rebellion. Sheriff Thomas Wardlaw arrived at Blackwood Plantation by mid-morning, accompanied by a hastily assembled posse of planters and their overseers from surrounding areas. Their investigation focused not on understanding what had happened, but on organizing pursuit of those who had escaped. Catherine Blackwood, once she recovered enough to speak, provided names of people she believed had participated in the rebellion. Her list was comprehensive, including not just those who had directly confronted her, but anyone she had ever suspected of discontent or resistance. The posse divided into groups, with trackers, including enslaved men forced to help hunt their own people, setting out to follow the rebels' trail. The escapees had perhaps 12 hours head start, moving through difficult terrain they knew from hunting and fishing expeditions, but their pursuers had horses, weapons, and the determined ruthlessness of men defending the economic system that enriched them. The first group of escapees was caught on August 16th, about 30 miles from Blackwood Plantation. They had been slowed by the presence of two elderly people who could not maintain the pace necessary for escape. According to testimony from one of the white posse members recorded decades later, the captured group offered no resistance, understanding that fighting would mean immediate death, while surrender might offer some possibility of survival. That testimony, discovered in a private journal in 1987, reveals what happened next with chilling clarity. Despite the escapees' surrender, the posse executed 4 of them immediately, including Samuel, who was identified as the rebellion's leader. The killings were meant as examples, designed to terrorize other enslaved people in the region and discourage any thoughts of resistance. The remaining captives were brought back to Blackwood Plantation to face William Blackwood's judgment. Blackwood had returned from Mobile upon receiving word of the rebellion, arriving at his plantation on August 17th to find chaos and death. His immediate response, documented in letters written shortly afterward, was rage at what he saw as betrayal by people he claimed to have treated well. The irony of this position, a man who had subjected his own daughter and his enslaved workers to systematic abuse claiming betrayal, apparently escaped him entirely. Other groups of escapees were tracked down over the following days. Some were caught attempting to reach Mobile, betrayed by their lack of knowledge about which white people might help and which would turn them in for reward money. Others were discovered hiding in the swamps, slowly starving as they tried to evade pursuers. A few, perhaps 5 or 6, were never accounted for and may have reached freedom, though no records confirm their successful escape. The violence inflicted on those recaptured shocked even some white observers accustomed to slavery's brutalities. Blackwood staged public punishments meant to terrorize the entire enslaved population of the county. Whippings that left permanent scars, brandings, separation of families as people were sold to the Deep South as punishment. All these became tools of retaliation against those who had dared to seek freedom. But the worst violence was visited upon those Blackwood believed had been closest to the rebellion's planning. Ruth, who had served in the main house and whose intelligence role was discovered, faced particular cruelty. She was subjected to public humiliation and punishment before being sold to a plantation in Mississippi, known for its brutal conditions. Her ultimate fate remains unknown, though oral histories suggest she did not survive long in her new circumstances. 3 of the captured rebels, men identified as having been in Margaret's room the night of her death, were handed over to civil authorities to face murder charges. The trial, held in late August 1849, was a formality. No enslaved person could testify against a white person, so the only evidence came from Catherine Blackwood's testimony, and the testimony of white men who had not witnessed the event, but who assured the jury that enslaved people were capable of such violence. The 3 men were convicted after less than an hour of deliberation and sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for September 10, 1849, and was made a public spectacle designed to reinforce the racial hierarchy and discourage further resistance. Hundreds of people attended, both to witness the state's power and to honor the men who had sought freedom. The executions were documented in newspaper accounts that treated them as entertainment, describing the men's final words and the crowd's reactions with casual cruelty. But oral histories preserved in black communities tell a different story, one of 3 men who faced death with dignity, who insisted to the end that they had harmed no one, and whose courage in death inspired others even as it was meant to terrorize them. The official investigation concluded with these executions, declaring the rebellion crushed and order restored. But the true story of what happened at Blackwood Plantation, Margaret's choice, the rebels' motives, the systematic abuse that drove people to desperate action, remained hidden, preserved only in whispered stories and fragmentary evidence that would take more than a century to emerge. Capítulo 8. O silêncio das gerações. 850 palavras. The aftermath of the Blackwood Plantation Rebellion rippled through the region for decades, shaping lives and communities in ways both visible and hidden. The official narrative, enslaved people murdering an innocent white woman, became accepted truth, while the actual story survived only in marginalized voices that the dominant society refused to hear. William Blackwood never recovered from the events of August 1849. His daughter was dead, his labor force decimated by executions and sales, his reputation damaged despite authorities' efforts to portray him as a victim. Correspondence from the 1850s shows him struggling to maintain the plantation's productivity, complaining bitterly about the need for constant surveillance and the cost of replacing skilled workers who had been executed or sold as punishment. His relationship with Catherine deteriorated after the rebellion. Letters between Catherine and her sister reveal a marriage poisoned by mutual blame. Catherine held William responsible for the abuse that led to Margaret's death and the rebellion that traumatized her. William blamed Catherine for failing to maintain control of the household during his absence. Neither apparently recognized their own moral culpability in the nightmare they had created. The plantation limped along for another decade before William Blackwood died in 1860, just as the nation descended into civil war. Catherine sold the property immediately afterward, moving to live with relatives in Georgia. She never spoke publicly about what had happened in 1849, and her private correspondence from later years suggests she worked actively to forget. Her descendants knew only that she had experienced something traumatic during her time in Alabama, without understanding the full story. The enslaved people who remained at Blackwood Plantation after the rebellion survived in a state of heightened terror and surveillance that lasted until emancipation. They were watched constantly, their movements restricted even more severely than before, their conversations monitored for any hint of discontent. The system had been shaken, and its defenders responded by tightening control wherever possible, but they could not prevent the preservation of memory. In churches and family gatherings, in coded songs and carefully passed down stories, the truth about the rebellion and Margaret Blackwood's choice survived. Each generation of descendants heard about Samuel's courage, Ruth's intelligence, and Margaret's final act of resistance against her father's tyranny. The names of those executed were remembered and honored, kept alive through oral tradition when official records listed them only as property destroyed or sold. The photograph, taken just weeks before the rebellion, became a strange relic in this hidden history. It passed through several hands after Catherine Blackwood's death, eventually ending up in a private collection whose owners knew nothing of its significance. For over a century, it was simply an old photograph of a plantation family, interesting mainly as an example of early photographic technique. In the 1920s, during the height of efforts to romanticize the antebellum South and portray slavery as benign, the story of Blackwood Plantation was retold in popular histories, but in a version so distorted as to be unrecognizable. Margaret became a martyr to faithful slaves corrupted by outside agitators. The rebellion was portrayed as aberration rather than resistance. The systematic abuse that prompted the uprising was erased entirely, replaced by paternalistic fiction about benevolent planters betrayed by those they had supposedly cared for. This mythologized version appeared in history textbooks used in Alabama schools, teaching generations of white students a false narrative designed to justify segregation and white supremacy. Black students, learning the same curriculum in their segregated schools, often heard different stories from grandparents and community elders, stories that preserved the truth even as official channels promoted lies. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s began to shift how history was told, opening space for previously suppressed voices to be heard. Black historians started documenting oral history systematically, recording the stories that had been passed down through families for generations. Among these stories was the account of what happened at Blackwood Plantation, finally being written down after more than a century of oral preservation. But it wasn't until 2003, when construction workers discovered the mass grave containing remains of rebellion victims, that physical evidence began confirming what oral histories had maintained all along. The forensic analysis of those remains revealed evidence of violence that contradicted official records claiming the executed slaves had received proper burials. Instead, they had been dumped in an unmarked grave, their deaths hidden just as the truth about their rebellion had been hidden. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the Blackwood Plantation story among academic historians. Researchers began digging through archives, cross-referencing documents, and interviewing descendants of those involved. The photograph resurfaced in 2017 when a descendant of the Blackwood family, learning about the renewed research, shared family materials she had inherited. Seeing the photograph again, now knowing the full context, researchers recognized details they had missed before. Margaret's expression no longer seemed merely sad but rather dissociated, showing signs of psychological trauma. Her physical condition suggested someone suffering from multiple health issues. The photograph's timing, taken just weeks before the rebellion, gave it new significance as evidence of the circumstances that led to those dramatic events.